Okay, great. Thanks everyone for coming. So, just an overview of the plan for today. So we'll define the problem. One of the annoying things about it is that there are many parameters to keep track of. So we'll try to break those down. Then we'll discuss some solution paradigms and wrap up the first half by talking about list decoding in the context of interactive coding. And then Bernard will talk about about some specific questions. So one set of questions about coding rate, paradigms for lower bounds. So this is FOCS. So a lot of, I think, of the exciting open problems are actually improving that things are impossible and understanding how exactly interactive communication and coding for it is different from one-way coding where everything had been solved. Not everything, but many things had been solved a long time ago. And he'll discuss another frontier, which is the multi-party case, where things really, the difference between having and not having interaction really becomes pronounced. Okay, so in the first 5-10 minutes, let's just go over some features. Am I too loud? Let's go over some features of the one-way scenario, just so that we have a reference base against, because then I'll say, oh, an interaction is the same, except there are people talking back and forth. So the basic goal in the one-way scenario is there is Alice, who is the speaker, and Bob, who is the receiver. And the goal is to send, there is some communication channel with some properties, and the goal is to send a message, which comes down to encoding the message, transmitting it over the channel, and then Bob decoding it. So that's basically one-way communication. And there is a whole, so basically, there's a whole field of study which studies this scenario, and the main concerns for it are, so one set of concerns has to do with the noiseless scenario. So this is Shannon's entropy comes into play, data compression. So imagine you don't have noise, what can be done? And then there is noisy coding, and two pretty different flavors. One has to do with random errors, which, so noisy coding with random errors, the important concept there for one-way communication becomes channel capacity, and the key insight there is that you can separate the channel that's being used from what you're trying to transmit over the channel. That's, if you wanted to get one idea out of coding theory, that would be, it seems completely obvious to us, but it's actually a striking idea. And noisy coding with adversarial error correction, that's much more combinatorial, basically trying to construct good distance codes and understand them. So this talk will be about error correction and specifically interactive error correction. Okay, so we assume substitution errors, even though it's meaningful to talk about erasures, insertions, and deletions, but there are enough dimensions to this problem as it is. So in the one-way world, there are concentrate codes that recover from an adversarial 49 error rate over a sufficiently large alphabet, and you can recover essentially from any rate for random errors, and you don't even need a large alphabet. But okay, so that's the picture in a nutshell, and this is not completely obvious, but if you weren't forced to actually construct, so constructing such codes is actually not that easy. Proving that they exist, I think, is not too bad. So I think it could be an exercise in combinatorics. Okay, so just the previous slide with the boxes a little more formally. So Alice has a word from alphabet sigma in of length k. She encodes it using a word over a different alphabet of length n, a code word of length n. Typically, she does it by adding some redundancy. So this might be a bigger alphabet, or n has to be bigger, or both. And then the channel transmits. Bob receives some m prime, which is usually a corruption of this ECC of m, and he's supposed to recover a k-bit string. So by the way, I changed the alphabet to a binary alphabet because it's the same. So the input, it doesn't matter if you don't like. If you want a larger alphabet, you can re-encode the binary. So for now, we can assume it's binary, and Bob is supposed to recover the word. What are the desirable properties? Well, first of all, it better work. So that's the first property. So decoding succeeds with high probability. So we want efficient encoding and decoding. So this function is better be efficient, and this function better be efficient. Maybe at least on legal inputs, and maybe it should be allowed to fail if it gets a word that doesn't seem to correspond to anything. And finally, it should get the rate of encoding. So the rate of encoding is the ratio between the amount of information Alice starts with and the amount of information she transmits over the channel. So she starts with k bits and she transmits effectively n log sigma out bits, right? Because n symbols from this alphabet. So this is the ratio by how much redundancy she blows up her message. And this is called the rate of the code, and ideally it would be 1. 1 of course has no redundancy, so you'll have lousy error correction properties. But you want to be as close to 1 as possible, at least you want to be positive. Which by the way, culturally this is perhaps the biggest difference between TCS and information theory. This constant is what it's all about in some sense, which is, so we don't stop at theta 1, we really care about those constants and understanding them. And also sigma out actually, depending on the channel, plays a role, and smaller alphabet is usually better and harder to obtain. So in one extreme, if you encoded everything here with one symbol and this symbol didn't get corrupted with good probability, then this would be very easy. So ideally, the smaller is better. So I listed at least 5 properties, 5 dimensions on which you can differ. So you can vary the channel, you can vary how efficient the code is, you can vary the rate and the alphabet. And here there are many, many combinations. The channel can be random, adversarial, may or may not have feedback, may not have erasures or insertions and deletions. So yeah, R here is not an official parameter, but it's just, yeah, so there are many combinations to work with, and this is exactly what we'll try to avoid doing today. Instead, I'll try to highlight some ideas. So it's possible to construct a laundry list of possible regimes, and it's not a bad idea, but it's somehow not something that's, this is the appropriate venue for. I'll mention but we'll mention some key dimensions about which we actually care. So this was the 5-minute introduction to one-way coding, and now, as promised, we'll just move with this arrow to the interactive regime. So there are 2 or more interacting parties, and same questions basically. So what do we mean? The same question, we want to pretend, so basically what happened here is, what's the goal? The goal is to pretend like there is no error, right? So Alice sends a message to Bob, and we want to do something so that they can actually pretend like there is no error on the channel. So the message Alice sends is received on the other end. And this is also how, in actual networks, that's the goal of, you typically have an error correction layer, and the next layer assumes that it actually works. So the goal is to pretend like there is not here, and that would be the goal there as well. So in one-way communication, the generic task is sending k bits, and it's very non-controversial that this should be the task, because anything else can be reduced to this task trivially. So if you don't like bits and you like bytes, it just becomes k times 8 here, and it's the same problem. So there is only one thing you can do when you transmit data. With interaction, it's not as uncontroversial. You can already start having different tasks with potentially different answers. Still, somehow, in some appropriate sense, you can argue that the complete task is simulating a generic binary k-round protocol, which I'll tell you in a second what I mean. And the only place where it's not quite where it matters is when you talk about rate, and it might affect the constant, which is something that Bernard will talk about more, and something that would be nice to actually understand better, because this abstraction that the task doesn't matter seems to, if not collapse, at least not hold as soundly in the interactive world. But here's the specific problem that addresses 95% of all issues. So this is the k-round pointer jumping problem, and you should think about it as trying to simulate the most general possible k-round protocol. So what is the most general k-round protocol? It's, okay, they go in turns, so Alice speaks, then Bob speaks, then Alice speaks, and at each round, based on the previous conversation, the party whose turn it is to speak knows what to say, either a 0 or a 1. So this is kind of the most generic k-round protocol. Moreover, up to a factor 2, it can simulate any other k-bit conversation, because if it was what else can happen is that Alice speaks and then Bob needs to send 2 bits. Well, so it can still be simulated with PJ 2k by Alice skipping some of the rounds. So basically, officially, formally, the problem is like this. You have a tree of depth k. Alice for each odd layer and for each node, Alice has one of these 2 edges labeled in blue, and for each even layer, Bob has one of these edges labeled in red. And this corresponds to, so if this edge is red, means that if Alice says 0, then Bob will want to say 1. And this red edge means that after a transcript of 1, 0, 1, Bob will want to send a 0. So you can transform any possible protocol, because we are not worried about efficiency issues for now, into this format, and then the goal is to find the unique red-blue path from root to leaf. So just following this. What is the communication complexity of this task without noise? It's not a trick question. Okay, right? So it's the natural thing. So at each round, the party who owns the layer will send either 0 or 1, and they'll add 1. So it's 0, 1, 1, 0, 1. Okay, so that's the goal. Now the goal is to find this unique red-blue path despite errors. And the only parameter here is k, the depth of the tree. Okay? So this is the problem we'll focus on for the next while at least. And okay, so what are the encoding and decoding functions? So at each round, Alice, based on the conversation so far and her own state, is supposed to decide what bit to send to Bob, what message, what symbol to send to Bob. This is Alice's ith message. And the decoder is supposed to only run in the end. So based on the entire conversation, Alice decodes a leaf, and correctness means that when Alice decodes the leaf and Bob decodes the leaf, both of them have the correct leaf. Okay, so that's, is this definition, any questions about it? So it's what you expect, there's no catch here. Okay, and the desirable properties should remind you the slide from a few slides back. Decode correctly with high probability, which means both players get to the correct leaf. Efficient encoding and decoding, and the rate again is, so this is what it would cost without errors, and this is what it costs with errors, and we want this blowout to not be too much. And again, sigma out, actually the size matters here. Okay, so just to point out that a round by round solution that does not take into account interaction will fail, and the reason is that somehow if the adversary manages to corrupt, say, the first message, and then it can retire, so Alice will think she's in this subtree, Bob will think they're in this subtree, so he'll send, so what will happen, so they move to this node. Now Bob thinks that, so he sends this 0. Alice thinks she's here, so she sends this 1. Bob thinks that he is here, he sends this 0. Alice thinks she's here, she sends this 0. So in the end, Alice will output this node, and Bob will output this node, and Bob will be wrong. And all this for 1 bit of corruption out of 5. So you need to somehow, it's not going to be just ignore the fact that it's interactive. So somehow it's essential. Okay, so here's a trivial solution. So you can always solve it in exponential in 2 to the k communication by flattening out, by flattening the communication tree. So basically, Alice can summarize her entire input with 2 to the k bits. Bob can do the same, and then they can just exchange those messages, wrap it with a normal error correcting code, and yeah, so basically you avoid dealing with interaction by making it non-interactive. And the reason, the way it comes into the proofs, okay, so is this clear? This is not a hit point, this is just an observation, but it's a terrible coding rate. It converts a k-bit thing to a 2 to the k-bit thing. But the point is that lower bounds, so impossibility results, the way you should parse them, that it's impossible unless you're willing to pay an exponential blowout. Because usually the lower bounds will say, oh, if you can deal with so much error, you can convert this protocol into a much fewer round protocol, which there are results starting with Nissan Victors that show exponential blowups in such a situation. Okay. So, questions we'll focus on. So noise resilience, even possibility is not obvious. So it's if the first time you see if it's not a tutorial, but you have a little bit of time, the first stages of dealing with interactive code, and the first one is denial. So you have some scheme that seems to work, and it's not clear why it's hard. And the second one is despair. So it's not even clear you can do anything against adversarial error. And then, yeah, then you graduate to more mature responses. But so it's basically, when is it possible to avoid at least an exponential block, or actually get a constant positive rate? For what it's worth, if you don't care about efficiency, we don't have any examples where you are in between. So it's either constant or nothing, untrivial. Computational efficiency, so assuming, okay, so the way I presented the problem, it's not efficient in the sense that the input size is 2 to the k. But assuming this input is given to you as an oracle or as a polytime algorithm, you want the whole thing to run in polytime. It's a very reasonable request, because basically the noiseless implementation only uses the tree as an oracle and queries it in k over 2 locations on each side. So another observation, that actually in one-way coding, encoding and decoding, there is a very big distinction in terms of you can easily construct codes that are easy to encode but are very hard to decode. Like if you keep adding random hashes, for example, you'll probably have all the noise resilience properties you want. It will be impossible to decode. Here, at least at this level, it's not an important distinction, because it's very hard to imagine you'll be able to make progress on an interactive protocol without knowing where you stand roughly in the tree. You could probably formalize this, but And rates, again, so by how much you need to blow up the communication, this will be subject of much of Bernard's talk. And unfortunately here, it might need to be refined by task, which we don't like, but if it's the truth, then yeah. Okay, so some disclaimers. It's a tutorial, so it's not exhaustive and doesn't have references for the most part. For references, so there is a fairly complete survey by Ron Gellis, so you should refer to it, called Coding for Interactive Communication, the survey, that you should refer to if you want. And if you want to work on specific problems, it's also a good idea to ask Ron or Bernard whether it's been solved, because initially I was hoping to include something comprehensive in this talk, but I think I'll try to focus on some specific ideas and directions that have more kind of general flavor. And if you want very specific questions, it's better to refer to the survey. The basic goal is to understand interactive computation, including new lower-bound techniques. So much of what I do is communication complexity and general complexity theory. So that's the goal. But this is just to give you an idea of why I don't plan to talk about specific results, because there are many different. So basically, remember how there is R to the K. R to the 5 settings, so you can linearize it, but it still looks like a big table. So this is from Ron's survey. But luckily, all of them, not all the results, but many of them, we can single out 2 paradigms for doing the coding, and I'll discuss them. So the rest of my part will focus on adversarial settings, so where there is an adversary who is allowed to corrupt messages at will, but they're interconnected with the randomized setting, because if you look at a sufficiently small scale, a randomized communication becomes adversarial, because once in a while, with probability 1 over 2 to the t, you have adversarial events happening for a stretch of time t. So they are interconnected here. So the first one is kind of to be expected in some sense, the rewind error paradigm. So we think about this pointer jumping task as simulating a protocol pi, which, I mean, that's how it was designed, so it shouldn't be surprising. So the simulation, so we are simulating a protocol, and what we do, we'll let it run for a while, and then we check if we noticed any errors had been introduced by the parties. So they run for a while, and they hope that they're still synchronized. So when an error is introduced, the parties will think they're in different places. So they're, like in the example in the simple example I showed in the beginning, the parties will, Alice and Bob will think they're in different places in the protocol tree. And then they can use some kind of hashing to check if errors happen. If no errors, then they're happy and they continue. And if errors happen, they rewind and try to get back to the place before an error was introduced. So this paradigm, what's nice about it, it's cheap in the sense that it's easy to explain, easy to implement, easy to reason about, easy to prove things about. It's efficient, so it's kind of it's easy in that sense. It uses randomness, which is not great, but if you want a deterministic scheme, because you end up using some kind of hashing. If you just use that, it will unfortunately fall short of the best possible error resilience in most scenarios. So that's one minus. Conceptually, a key feature of it is that parties try to maintain a joint state over the communication. So they try to know where they stand with respect to each other, and when they realize they don't know, they'll try to go back and figure out so that they do know. And yeah, even TCP/IP or practical things somehow it's not exactly this scenario, because there you need to worry about deletions and other things, but you're trying, the goal of trying to stay synchronized is basically, it's hard to imagine a practical system for now which doesn't strive to do that. So let's assume each symbol is actually large. So you have blocks, you're working with blocks of size log k. If you don't, you run into more, you need to work harder. But what happens at size log k is you can start using hashing that works with high probability. And basically, so I'll go over this very quickly because Bernard will elaborate more on this type of protocols. So we basically repeat the following simple procedure. We run protocol T and record the and the parties record the transcript. So they send their current, they exchange hashes of their current state. So they have some hash function here. So they tell each other where they stand. And if they're consistent, they continue, and if not, they throw out the last round. And also one thing that can happen that even in this this is pretty pedestrian, but so already we need to worry about the following things. So we said if they disagree, they roll back. So in an adversarial scenario, what can happen is that Alice thinks she's fine, Bob thinks that they're not. So Bob rolls back, Alice stays put or advances, and that's something you have to worry about. So it's a real possibility. So in addition, you have to also send the length of how, not only a hash of where you are, but how far you are. And if one party gets ahead of another, you'll want to roll it back. So if you realize that you think you're much farther along than your partner, you have to remove additional round to get them to synchronize. And the analysis is basically, so I'll go over it pretty quickly because it's not important. What's important for me is that there is an analysis. And basically it says, it defines an energy function that says how wrong we are. So this is the good part, and this is the part where they disagree and they're wrong. And if you define this energy function, on a good round, the potential increases. So either you advance or you remove some of the badness. In a bad round where the adversary can do some of the nasty things I mentioned, like roll back Alice and let Bob advance incorrectly, the worst that can happen, it goes up, it decreases by at most 3. So as long as the ratio between the good and the bad rounds is better than 3 to 1, we win within a linear amount of time. So basically we can tolerate up to a quarter of bad rounds, which translates into handling an error of 1/8. Why 1/8? Because it's enough to corrupt. I didn't say what it means to corrupt a round, but it's easier to not corrupt a round means to not touch Alice or Bob. So to corrupt a round means to touch one of them, and it costs you half because of that. Anyway, this is not important. The point to show is that it is a 2-slide analysis. They didn't hide too much stuff. So the second paradigm, which is very different and is the tree-code paradigm, which was introduced by Schulman in the 90s. And it's especially useful in higher constructions. When you want to push yourself all the way to the theoretically best possible error, that's where it really shines. So what goes wrong with the previous example of the alphabet is small is that the adversary can derail small pieces of the protocol at a potentially very low cost. And if you are really, really trying to be consistent, so you could probably you can definitely make it work if the error is very small, and if you're allowed to use randomness. But if you're not allowed to use randomness, which is inherent in all these hashing tricks, or if the error is really close to the theoretical maximum, there is not enough redundancy somehow. We are too generous. Basically, every time there is structure, some parts of your protocol are more important than others, and the adversary will attack them. So if you want to be resilient to the maximum possible rate, the only thing you can do in some sense, it has to be completely squishy, your communication. It has to have no special parts to attack. It should be like a block where it doesn't matter where you stab it, it hurts equally badly, or it doesn't hurt. So okay, so what's a tree code? It's in some sense a magical object because it usually in these types of scenarios, at least essentially it always does what you want. It's also abundant, similarly to expanders. So I kind of, if you've seen expanders, it's kind of similar. So any graph is an expander, but it's actually hard to construct one explicitly. So even though, yeah, any graph. So efficient we don't have efficient encoding and decoding for tree codes. So I'll talk about it in the open problems section. It's useful for the most robust coding results we have in various models, including in models where it's very hard to see how to deal with it using other methods. And basically, you combine by combining so a little bit of magic with this rewind and error paradigm, you can actually get pretty good efficient codes already. And so I'll mention a little bit how after I define tree codes. So the tree code is used to code messages from some alphabet. So you should think about it as a deer. So here d is equal to 2, so you have a deer tree. And you label each edge of the tree with an alphabet pi, which is typically bigger. So here d is 2 and pi is 4. And basically the way you encode is you follow down the tree. So the encoding of 0 is A. The encoding of 0, 1 is AA. The encoding of 1, 0, 1, 1 is B, D, AA, and so on. So that's the object. That's the tree code object. I didn't tell you anything about distance, so next let's talk about distance. So the distance of a code means that for every two vertices that diverge some distance apart, so U and V are two nodes in the same depth, and let's say this is their divergent part. So typically, what does it mean to be a good code? It means that if I take two words in the code, they should be very different. That's distance. Here it would be, so how different U and V can be? Because of the tree structure, it would be unfair to hold them responsible for the fact that they coincide here. Because this is by design, this is a feature. So all we can do is demand that once the branches diverge, they look very different, and that's exactly what we demand. So for that part, we want the distance A to be 1 minus epsilon times the length. And interestingly, so it's enough to have an alphabet size. So this is, for epsilon constant and D constant, this is a constant. So I don't know, if you want distance 0.5, maybe it's enough to have an alphabet of size 4 or 6 or something. Okay, so and we'll actually be able to sketch a proof of this, of its existence, which is it's pretty surprising that it's easy to prove, but you should remember that it's also very easy to prove that expanders exist. But it's very hard to construct one, or not. By now, it's not very hard, but it's not trivial. Okay, so for depth d equals to 1, it's trivial. A tree code of depth 1 is just label all the children
differently. So now we want to go, I want to give you a randomized construction that takes a tree code of depth d, converts it into a tree code of d plus 1, succeeds with a constant probability, which by probabilistic method means that it succeeds, that it's possible to do. So okay, so here is what I do. I just take my tree code and I copy it and I add a parent with these edges labeled with different labels. Okay, so is this a good tree code? Well, yes and no. So yes, for anything for any two paths originating in one subtree, it works. So what doesn't work in a pretty bad way is that these two paths have a distance of 1. Right? They completely coincide except the first symbol. So this is horrible. But luckily this is the only thing that we need to worry about. And here is the trick. So in this child, at each level we randomly select this random permutation sigma of the symbols. So we permute the alphabet, the labels here, at the first layer with sigma 1, second layer with sigma 2, and so on. And okay, so it's still all the paths that happen to pass in this tree are equally happy because nothing happened, as far as they're concerned, nothing changed, just the names of the labels changed. And what about these two? So now we can, if we look at any two paths, one in this tree and one in this tree, and we look at the probability they have small distance, these two, they just, if I just focus on these two paths, they look like two random strings. And you have your Chernoff, you can, so the probability that something goes wrong is exponentially small in the depth. You have to multiply by 4 to the L because that's the number of possible pairs. But I can make this x smaller by making pi a bigger constant. And so, essentially, for depth L, something goes wrong with probability x to the minus L, and I can make it converge. So it adds up to something constant and we win. Okay, so by the way, this is not a high probability construction, but it's a constant probability construction. And actually, it's not even constant if you go over all the layers. I think you can prove that random linear convolution would be a tree code, but with a constant probability. But yeah, it's still nice that this is a one-slide proof, maybe 2 slides. Okay, so some more philosophy. It's useful against adversarial error. And what we do is we wrap communication with a tree code, and we decode using best fit decoding. And so the point is that the adversary, to prevent a word from being read that's been sent a long time ago, the adversary will need to pump a lot of errors in. So let me draw you a picture. Suppose Bob sent a vertex u, that's what he meant. So back here he was sending 0. And the adversary wants to keep Alice from receiving this 0. So the adversary tries to to get Alice to decode this v. Right? So this is the scenario. Bob actually meant to was sending things consistent with u, and Alice decoded things consistent with v. That means that the received string C is closer to B than to A, right? Otherwise, because she decodes the closest thing. And we know that A and B are very different, so it means that A and C are very different, or at least half the distance. That means that in order for Alice to not receive this 0 here, to think that this 0 is a 1, for the last d rounds here, the adversary will need to spend like d over 2 errors. So if you want to prevent Alice from receiving a symbol for a long time, you can, but you'll have to keep lying more and more. You'll have to keep spending your budget. So And what it boils down to is this statement. So when designing protocols using tree codes, you don't worry as much about synchronizing the state of mind. So they wouldn't, especially as you get into things like list decoding, which I mentioned, you really don't try to hold on to this notion, oh, I think I know where I am, I might be right or I may be wrong, but you have to really let go somehow. So here is an example. We are dealing with a constant size alphabet, and we want to solve the pointer jumping problem at a constant rate. So we want the constant alphabet here is allowed to depend on epsilon, and despite a quarter minus epsilon errors. So the adversary is allowed to corrupt a quarter of all the communication, almost, and we still want to be able to do the pointer jump. And the main point, this is not the state of, well, I mean, for this specific problem, maybe it is, but the point is not that this is kind of somehow the most important example, but it's the easiest one to illustrate the philosophy of using tree codes, of not knowing where you are. So here is the philosophical difference. So rewind if error based on having a conversation between parties. So each party tries to understand where the other party stands, fix it if it's wrong, and have a synchronized state of mind. And the tree codes are based on a pair of streams where you don't try to respond to your opponent, your partner. You just you say things that you think are right and hope that things work out in the end. And it's less efficient because it appears less efficient, and we don't know in the end whether the best rate schemes, well, some of the best rate schemes we know that don't use tree codes, but it might be less efficient in terms of rate, but it is able to withstand extreme error rates somehow. Because even if your partner goes crazy for a little while, it doesn't derail you too much because well, we'll see an analysis actually, but that's the philosophy. And okay, so, oh sorry, I changed the K to N accidentally. Anyway, so we are trying to do the jumping task, and let's assume for now, so for a technical, it's not important. Let's assume that we have a huge alphabet. So we are able to send a block of n bits at once. I'll change it in a second, but to ease the cognitive load. This is a reasonable assumption to make. Note that it's not obvious. So the alphabet size 2 to the n means you are allowed to put n blocks of size n at once. It's not clear how to do the quarter minus epsilon error in this model. But each message can describe the entire engine. And the tree codes, basically, so what you do with the tree code, you take your Twitter stream from before, and you encode each symbol using a tree code. So so this will be the messages, and Bob receives those messages encoded in the tree code. And the key property is that if Alice sends a message here, puts a message T on her Twitter code here, and the first time Bob decodes it correctly is here, then between this time and this time, the error rate is almost half, going from this way. So the adversary, to keep Bob for 4 rounds from receiving this message T, the adversary needs in between here to have an error rate of almost half. That's the thing from before. So to cause a delay between the time a message is sent and the time a message is received, the adversary will need to pay in between here. Okay, so here is now the protocol. Alice sends a stream of blue edges, and Bob sends a stream of red edges. And so they'll never say anything wrong. They'll only say things that are irrelevant, and that's the nice thing. So in this rewind and rewind error paradigm, you're liable to say things that are wrong. You might say, oh, let's go back, and we shouldn't go back. So you might be wrong. Here you're never wrong, sometimes you're just irrelevant. And because of that, because somehow when you're wrong, you pay twice, because the adversary doesn't need to pay for the rounds when you're wrong. It can just let you be wrong. And you'll do its job for it. Here, you're never wrong, you just send edges that are potentially irrelevant. So for example, Alice sends E1, Bob hears E2, so he sends E5. But remember, this is not go left, this is the whole edge E5, so it's not wrong. It's just not relevant because eventually, once he realizes it's E1, he sends E4, and they're back on track. So both streams are encoded using tree codes, and at each step, Alice decodes the red edges she has from Bob's stream and tries to continue. So in this case, what's the next edge she puts on the stream?
E10.
E10. And okay, so here's the analysis in one slide. I mean, it takes a little more to write formally, but basically this is it. So let's denote by the times. These are the times they realize they get to the ith edge on the correct path. So Alice immediately sends T1. This is the E1. This is the first thing she does. Between the time this happens and Bob responds to the correct edge, here we have an error rate of half in this direction. Here we have an error rate of half in this direction. Here they have an error rate of half in this direction, and so on. So in all but n rounds, you have an error rate of quarter minus epsilon, and the math works out. You need to blow up the communication by something like 1 over epsilon if the error rate is quarter minus epsilon. And again, so this statement that you need this error rate completely doesn't care about what else happens. And that's somehow why the analysis works. And none of the rounds here, there are no service rounds. So at each round, Alice does the exact same thing. So it's not like there are important rounds where, there are unimportant rounds where they decide, where they just send information, and important rounds where they decide strategic questions. It all looks the same. Okay, so and is this clear? So this is 90% of the work. So reducing alphabet size is actually pretty simple. The algorithm stays exactly the same, and it's not so important for the story, but I'll just show it because it's quick and it shows that I'm not cheating. So here's how you save. So before we needed n bits to say E10. Can we say it in less? So because by the time you decode this point, you also have decoded the rest of the stream, there is a faster way to say E10. You can say it by reference. If E10 is in the stream, so it's its grandparent. So instead of saying E10, you can send a pointer to E1 and say, oh, I'm the right grandchild of E1. So you immediately cut your cost from n bits to specify E10 to roughly log n bits. So the alphabet size of order n, because you only need to specify a location in the stream and 2 bits. So that saves you and gives you a rate of 1 over log n. And if you haven't seen it before, especially the students, how can you save it even more? How can you save even more and send in this link? So if I want to avoid paying log n bits, so if you need to send the link in a stream and the link is not too far, how can you avoid paying the cost of the full address?
Just like the offset?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So the next trick is to just, instead of sending the full address, you send the offset. And sure, once in a while you can have an offset that's linear and you have to pay log n bits, but typically it's a constant size offset because in the end, remember, we'll have n things spread out over 10 n things. So if you have n numbers that add up to 10n, the worst their encoding can take is log 10 times it's not too bad. It's log 10 times n. So the typical offset will be constant, even though once in a while it might be log. And that's it. So that got us to the constant size alphabet. There is really nothing more to it. Okay, so how can you now profit by combining the two paradigms? So the pain was, so once we got to chunk sizes of size log k or more, actually you have hash and you have stuff, you're in pretty good shape. So the nasty, we are worried about adversary ruining small chunks. And basically what you can do is you put the tree code in charge of dealing with small chunks, and then as an inner code to deal with this problem, and you deal with this rewind if error paradigm to deal with at the larger scale. And even though tree codes are inefficient, actually this thing as a whole is efficient because you only ever use tree codes of depth log k. So, which actually means that even sub-exponential tree codes already give you something because it translates into sublinear downstairs. Shouldn't get too close. It was ours, right? Yeah. Okay, so the three parameters we care about is error resilience, efficiency, and coding rate. And let's talk about error resilience for a moment. So what can we hope for? So in the one-way communication, we can recover from half minus epsilon errors, adversarial errors, and it's not hard to see that you cannot do better. Why? Because if there are two code words, I can always come up with the word right in the middle between them, and you won't know, there's no way you would be able to decode, because it can decode to either. What's the best we can hope for in the interactive setting? The answer depends on the communication model, so let's assume the simplest non-adaptive model where the order of speakers is fixed in advance. So in each round, we know who is speaking. Then a quarter minus epsilon, I argue, is the best you can hope for the same reason, because let's suppose Alice speaks less than Bob. So again, we can just create two Alices, and half the time we act like, so Alice with two personalities, and half the time we act like Alice 1, and half the time we act like Alice 2. So the resulting thing will have a disagreement of quarter with each of the two protocols, and there is no way you would be able to figure out which Alice it is. So the quarter minus epsilon is the best you can hope for. And yeah, so, and that's what we got with the, and that's what we got with the construction, with the tree code construction. But if you wanted to really worry about, so when we wrap one code over another, if you really wanted to worry about the error rate, so here is something, this is actually, this example is a little misleading, but I think it's the simplest example to illustrate the point, so I'll give it anyway. So suppose we concatenated two codes. So basically, I have two codes, one that is C2 that's this inner code, so that encodes sigma to the D0, D null to sigma to D1. And I have an outer code that takes all these blocks and encodes it into one long word. So this is kind of the cartoon of what's going on when you wrap, say, rewind the fair around the tree code based code. So if both codes have error resilience around half, if you naively combine them, you'll get an error resilience of a quarter, because somehow to get the wrong answer, it's enough to corrupt 51% of 51% of the blocks. Right, so then these blocks get decoded to the red thing, and then reds have a majority, and the whole thing gets decoded incorrectly. So the way you deal with it is by using weights, by soft decoding. And so if you knew that this thing decodes to 51% red and 49% yellow, and this is 0 red and 100% yellow and so on, then we could see which gets more weight overall and decode. So you need something called soft decoding, and moreover, so this smells a lot like least decoding. So in the case of, in this scenario, you actually don't need least decoding, but in the interactive case setting, so imagine you were moving from left to right and you didn't know, so you didn't know the future. So somehow it's actually useful to worry about both of them simultaneously, and for that you need the notion of interactive least decoding. So that's what I'm getting at. And I'll maybe have another motivating example that's a little easier to explain on the fly. So we want to have and least decoding. Okay, so least decoding for interactive protocols means that after the execution, each party outputs a list of C possible conversations that happen. And this really takes this concept of not having a state to the limit. Because it means that it's not only that we don't know where we are, there is each of us has a list of possible things we might be talking about, and somehow we still hope to, in the end, for this list not to diverge completely. It's actually, yeah, it seems that this must not exist for sure, but it's possible to do it. If the total level of corruption is less than half minus epsilon, and this is the best you can hope for, because once you're at half, you can completely kill one player, for example, or you can turn the protocol into a 2-round protocol by first completely shutting down Alice and then completely shutting down Bob completely, so it becomes a 2-round protocol. So interactive least decoding, so it's a different theory. Yes. It actually needs a slightly stronger variant of tree coding, and this is an example where really it's hard to imagine how you would do it purely with other construction, which is actually maybe it's something that should be done with other constructions just to learn how to do it, but that's really where we need tree codes. And as a result, you get this map. So I'll explain what this map shows. This is where, so assuming this is the rate at which Alice is corrupted, between 0 and 1, and this is the rate at which Bob is corrupted. So the total error, assuming the protocol is balanced, the total error is the sum. So this line is when they add up to a half, which means a quarter error rate. So this is what this region is what I explained from before. And this is the region in which you can do least decoding. So basically, as long as there is some signal, you can actually get the least out of it, which is... and this cauliflower-like shape here, the red line, is the region in which unique decoding is still possible. So it has points here that are above this region. And okay, so and I'll explain why you need least decoding for it in a second. So this picture is for large alphabet, actually a nagging open problem that I thought I'd present here because it doesn't fit well into the story, but it's annoying enough to percolate up. Is what happens over small alphabets, so like the binary alphabet. So you can always take any alphabet of size 100, convert it using some distance half like code into a binary, like Hadamard code, into a binary alphabet with distance half. And so I can always go from a quarter to an eighth, but we actually don't know that you cannot do better. So that's a nagging open problem. And okay, so I want you to appreciate that getting decoding below this red line is a purely, there is nothing list about it. It's a purely decoding problem. So if you assume a budget of, say, 0.3 on each side, but nonetheless it seems that you need some notion of list decoding, and maybe it's a better motivating example than the previous one. So here's what the adversary can do. For the first 60% of the protocol, corrupt Alice to, so you can't kill her, but you can create doubt between two different Alices. So for the first 0.6 time of the protocol, Bob is left wondering who is Alice. There are two possible Alices, and every day you're not sure which one you're talking to. So, and you can do it within the budget. And for the last 60%, you corrupt half of Bob. So if to advance, if they wait to be able to decode correctly, to make progress, so basically the adversary can always keep Bob believing in the wrong Alice. So the wrong Alice is slightly more likely, so he keeps talking to her, and then here it actually he stops, so it becomes the real Alice. But now Bob, it's too late because now Bob is half corrupt. And the only solution is somehow to talk to both Alices at the same time. So here, if the adversary corrupts half of Alice, it's like in the list decoding, where in normal list decoding there's only luckily two Alices. It's not like an unlimited number, so he should be talking to both of them simultaneously. And supporting this with the tree codes, I think this is really a place where it seems somehow unavoidable, the most unavoidable, because it really seems like you need to be state free for that. And with list decoding, it's actually, once you believe in the list decoding primitive, it's actually not hard to see that you can do it. So, because basically you maintain a list of two Alices, and you resolve the ambiguity in there. Yeah.
How large are these lists in general? Will they be constant size or like?
Yeah, they're constant size.
Okay.
Because if they're not constant size, you'll be in trouble because you actually need to talk to k people.
Okay.
So your rate of talking to each one of them is 1 over k. So yeah, so.
But could it be like probably 1 over epsilon if like your epsilons are?
Yeah, it will be something like 1 over epsilon.
Yeah. Okay, yeah.
It
won't depend on the length.
If the error rate is half minus epsilon, it means that epsilon fraction of the time you have to agree with the right person, which means roughly that there can be at most 1 over epsilon right people.
Yeah.
So, and as long as you kind of talk to all of them, it turns out that you're making progress. Okay, so this is what I wanted to say about list decoding. So briefly about efficiency issues. So we do have efficient, something like near linear actually time overall schemes that work up to the maximum possible error, and they work always by the best one general one is the Jafari-Hopler 2014 scheme. And they work by wrapping the combinatorial structure around the tiny tree code based construction. So you start with a tiny tree code and then you use combinatorial construction to make it work for bigger protocol sizes without losing it. And they use randomness. They can be made deterministic in a non-uniform way, like in the same way you prove that BPP is in P/poly. It's not, so it's completely unclear how to make them really deterministic, as in, I don't know, use with explicit hashes or anything like that. So the final, in terms of rate issues, which is okay, so efficiency, I guess there isn't much more to be said here. It's to the first, up to the randomization, it's actually a solved problem. this randomization is a completely open problem. That's the summary of it. So the challenge there is to make things de-randomized, even though I must say if you have to de-randomize something, de-randomize the tree code construction. It will be more fun. Rates, on the other hand, is completely open. So for example, this question looks completely inaccessible, even though it looks completely innocuous. I give you a binary symmetric channel with error 1/3, and you want to solve the pointer jumping. How many? I mean, the answer is some constant times k. It's a constant between 1 and 2. Find a way to find it, or even a way to reason about it. Seems to be difficult with current techniques. On the other hand, people haven't tried hard enough, so it might be more of a double E question, but I don't know. I don't like those distinctions. I think it's a very reasonable question actually to ask. So unfortunately. Okay, so this is a challenge, but also an opportunity. The answer depends both on the task and the channel, but maybe we just don't have the right theory. Maybe with the right theory it will stop depending, or there should be some principles to understand, and the plot becomes much thicker once you have more players. So there it's actually, the stakes are no longer constants, as you'll see from Bernard's talk. Okay, so let's summarize. So rate questions and multi-party questions we'll discuss later. With regard to achievability, ignoring rate, so just error. If you just want to get things done and you don't worry about factor 2 or factor 4 in rate, the biggest, there are three things that the whole thing revolves around: tree codes, randomness, and combinatorial constructions, which is basically everything else. So here's the problem. The tree code-based constructions have great properties, but there are no explicit constructions known. So the things we know how to do is we can say, sometimes you can say, okay, brute force a tree code of depth log n and work from there, and sometimes it's good enough. But it would be nice to, so, when I started looking at these problems, 6 years ago or so, it looked like, okay, a tree code is a nice construction from one paper. Maybe it's incidental that it's useful, but by now it seems that, okay, specifically a tree code as it was defined, maybe we can avoid using, but things like it seems to be essential if you want to push your error rate to the limit. And so I can promise you that if you construct just a plain tree code the way I defined it, that's efficient, it will solve all the problems, but it would tremendously improve our understanding of interactive coding. So, and again, okay, so one way to kind of make everything de-randomized and explicit is to construct tree codes, and as the time passes by, I think it becomes a better and better motivated problem to actually do it, even of independent interest. Alternatively, we can say, okay, we don't care, maybe we weren't good enough, and you don't need tree codes to go all the way to the limit in these problems. Okay, so one problem is that you need private randoms, but actually I think it would be great to get rid of tree codes in some of these constructions, in part because it would probably lead to new insights that we can even use, advise TCP/IP people on. How else can you protect interaction? Or, okay, and again, in terms of constructing tree codes, okay, it's one thing to make them explicit, but also it's not just a matter of making them explicit, it's also probably by the time you construct them with encoding and decoding, it will teach us something more, so they'll be more structured and it will, so it will move the field forward. As I said, alternatively get a combinatorial construction that achieves the optimal resilience for pointer jumping. And by the, okay, so okay, so and in terms of constructing tree code, so I should say something that is known. So there is a simple construction. I think it never was published by Schulman et al. That gives you a rate of 1 over log k. Basically, you write a good error-correcting code that takes care of every scale. So there is one code that encodes blocks of 2 bits, one code that encodes blocks of 4 bits, 8 bits, and so on. And if you write them together, you get something that looks like a tree code, but it doesn't have a constant rate. So here are some goals that are actually solvable, but so an explicit construction. So actually it turns out that for many of the tasks, including this decoding, if I write a random code, just populate the branches randomly, it will be good enough to accept an exponentially small probability. So it really becomes, so the way that the construction that I proved is not like that, but for all practical purposes, it's actually any tree is good. And of course, if I populate the tree with digits of pi, it will work. Just as an expander populated with digits of pi, and the universal traversal sequence I'd be a bit worried about, because you can maybe construct pi in log space, but most things, yeah, digits of pi are pretty good for. But how do you, obviously, yeah, so we don't have explicit constructions. So efficient encoding and decoding, remember that earlier I told you that in the context of an entire conversation, this distinction is not important. In the context of an individual tree, it becomes again important because, and actually it's more than that because decoding has to be refined further. So at least efficient means polynomial in the code's depth. And more ambitiously, especially for decoding, you can ask, okay, I want to decode, so if I already decoded part of it and I want to just decode this part, starting from here, you can even potentially ask to be polynomial in L, in the chunk you're trying to decode. My personal prediction is that if you can solve this problem, this will follow. And one final thought about, so what's really conspicuously missing in this entire discussion, so people who've been in coding theory or have taken a course. So what do you usually hear about when you talk about code constructions? Well, algebra. Somehow, yeah, I think it's actually quite possible, so just for idiosyncratic reasons, that the people who would be the best to kind of, who are experts on algebraic constructions and all the wonderful things that are happening in the locally decodable, correctable codes using more and more advanced use of polynomials and even algebraic geometry, maybe it's actually not that impossible to get to those explicit constructions. I think they're better motivated now than a few years ago in the sense that pure combinatorics doesn't seem to have bypassed it, so that's something to look into. Yeah, so thanks. Yeah, so I usually put a photo of the venue. That's a nice one. That was the first thing, but after Googling more, this is actually a local photo. Okay, so I was hoping for more discussion or questions, but yeah.
So at the end, when you said that like random trees are very likely to be tree codes, Is it? I imagine it's still really hard to verify that you're using time if you have it. Is that kind of?
Yeah, they're not likely to be tree codes, but they're likely to do what you're actually wanting them to do.
Oh, I see.
So if you just plug that in, so there's something called potent tree codes, for example, that are tree codes almost all the time. And those are good because basically what will happen is if it's not really a tree code, but it's really almost a tree, it's a tree code almost everywhere. Okay, so once in a while you'll find yourself unlucky and there'll be a branch where your time will get wasted. But as long as it doesn't happen too often on the same path, it can happen a lot in the tree in different places. You never will experience a lot of pain as long as it doesn't happen on the same path. So even though it's very likely to happen a lot, it's extremely unlikely to happen a lot with the same person, with the same execution. So a random tree is actually good enough, I think. So you can just plug, like if you run the protocol I showed with a random tree, I think it will just work. Yeah, it will, as is. What will happen once in a, you'll have to pay another penalty in the form, oh, suddenly I can't decode because two branches look exactly the same. Okay, so I'll take it as a penalty. We haven't advanced. Again, because the only thing, the worst thing that can happen to you in that protocol is that you waste time. As long as you don't waste too much time, that's okay. So you give an extra bonus to that person. Yeah, but again, verifying it, yeah.
Yeah, just retreat does as well.
It is as hard as anything. Constructing good codes, one-way codes, is not a completely trivial task. So, yeah. So, but that's been solved. So, maybe with the right algebra, it's actually that's the way to go with. I don't think there is anything. Is there anything for this interactive setting? I don't think there was any mileage. So. Okay, so combinatorial constructions are, once you start reasoning about where you are and start constructing trees and things like this, it's actually combinatorics shows up naturally. Algebra you have to skillfully put in there. I think it's not hard to see that if you take a random string and take convolutions with it, and make this your tree code, then that's a tree code. And the nice thing about it, it's self-similar. So actually, it's a tree code with constant probability. Essentially, the analysis I showed before works, and you only need to do it once because it will look the same at every scale because it's a convolution.
Sorry, what's a convolution? Sorry.
So basically, there isn't a word. So basically, you write a bunch of numbers, and then your first so you have a vector of a random vector, and then the first symbol is a1 times x1. The second symbol is a1 times x2 plus x2 times a1, and so on. So you keep shifting the stuff that you wanted to send times the coding vector, and that's your code.
So A1 is the message. The A's are the message you want to send? Or?
A's are the code and the X's are the messages. Say.
Okay.
And so every time, so basically to send the I symbol, you need the first I X's, and if you want to see if once things change from some location, it's like taking the head off. So it looks, so the tree at every level looks like a shifted version of the tree at the top, because you just add to it some constant inner product. And so you only need to worry about it at one point, and I think it should work, but again, it works for any vector. We can't find it. But it's the standard problem in the randomization. Another question is, it's not, so that, okay, it's not, I don't think it's complex. It's sophisticated enough to be called algebraic, but it's not clear how to decode it. So usually when you have truly algebraic things like polynomials, there are different tricks you can do to decode them, like sample some points and build the lower order curves through it. Usually there is more interesting things you can do with such structure. And this is, I think, in terms of fundamentals, and in terms, this is the most interesting direction to explore. how hard it is. I mean, I don't think enough people know enough about the book to it. But maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. But, some people, I think Anup, Rao, Schumann, they spend some time on it, but yeah. Yeah, but they're also, so they're randomizing people, which is, it might not be it might be that, maybe not completely standard, but normal techniques from coding, from algebraic coding theory actually can get mileage here. I mean, there are no strong meta reasons against it. Okay, more discussion or questions? So after the coffee break, Bernard will talk about multi-party scenarios. So the spoiler there is that there actually it's not true that everything is a constant rate slowdown, and about efficient constructions. We'll reconvene it. Maybe we can start a little earlier because, oh, it's actually exactly 4, so 4:30. Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Yeah. So